greet everyone and tell you how pleased we are to have you join us today to discuss the general topic of vaccinations and how it might implicate and impact both employers and employees. The goal, of course, in today's world is to maximize protection from the virus. And in addition to the recommendations of health authorities for social distancing and masking, the best way to protect all of us at this point seems to be vaccination. We've all lived through very turbulent times for the past 15 months, and it's affected every aspect of our professional and personal lives. Both the family, social, and the professional. We've missed and not been able to join in events, life cycle events like marriages, deaths, family gatherings, and celebrations. From a professional perspective, many of us have had to work remotely and not from our offices. Personally, I haven't been behind the desk in my office since March 13th of 2020. The landscape as to restrictions and vaccinations seems to be changing almost daily. And today what we are going to do is present you with 3 fact scenarios. These scenarios are similar to situations that have been presented to us for an opinion by clients. What we will do is we will share the screen with you and give you an opportunity to read each of the scenarios. And then I will invite our participants to join in and take a position that's consistent with either that of the employer or the employee union or a patron, as the situation may be. I'd like to first of all introduce to you the members of the panel. I'm joined this morning with Joe Masterson, who is a partner of the firm and is a specialist in employment law and deals with these types of problems on a regular basis. Alicia Christian, who is also a partner at Learners, and Alicia specializes in the area of privacy law as well as employment law. And George Hamzo, who is an associate who also specializes in general commercial litigation with a focus on employment law. At the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a place for Q&A, questions and answers. Because we cannot connect with you directly, we're going to ask that if you have any questions, you submit them in writing, and we have someone monitoring the Q&A column, and we'll get to your questions in due course. What I suggest that we do is we'll give an opportunity to ask questions after each of the 3 scenarios and leave time at the end for more general questions that any of you might have that relate to vaccinations in particular and adjustments that we need to make because of the impact of the pandemic. So if we could put up the first fact scenario on the screen, and I will give you an opportunity to read it. And I'm going to begin by asking Joe Masterson to give us the perspective of an employer. Sorry, I think we're going to start with George. George is going to start from the perspective of the employee who is confronted with what appears to be a mandate from the employer. So George.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Well, the employee submits that the proposed policy of the employer represents an unprecedented intrusion into the employee's private affairs. An employer has no standing at common law and no statutory right to receive medical information of this kind. And Moreover, an employee's decision about whether to obtain the vaccine is a deeply personal choice. And so therefore, compliance with this policy would represent an unprecedented and in my view, unauthorized intrusion into an employee's private affairs. Now, I also like to point out that such a mandate or policy is unnecessary and disproportional to the threat that we're facing. I would submit that it's just simply not reasonable. First of all, September 7th is an arbitrary date and does not reflect the reality of the shortage of vaccines that we're facing in Ontario. Now, while we've heard rumblings of an influx of mRNA vaccines, this has yet to happen. And I think we all know how smooth the rollout of vaccines has gone in Ontario so far. And so simply from a practical perspective, the company's expectations are just not realistic and not achievable. And I should point out that the company has coped very well with working remotely. Our present surroundings will attest to this fact. We can adapt and we have adapted, and there's no reason why the company has to rush everyone back to work to the office on September 7th. Now, furthermore, the policy, at least as far as I can tell, is not consistent with the best available science. Obtaining only one shot of the vaccine, which is what the employer is proposing, will not provide an employee with full protection. Most of the vaccines available will require at least 2 shots to achieve the kind of efficacy that, in my view, would justify recalling all of the firm's staff. And so again, forcing people back to work when they've only received 1 shot of the vaccine puts them at unnecessary risk rather than protecting them from potential exposure, which I would hope was the goal of the policy in the first place. Additionally, we should point out that some employees may have real and valid concerns about the vaccines that are available to them. Just 4 days ago, I should point out that the National Advisory Committee on Immunization advised that mRNA vaccines like the Pfizer vaccine were preferred over the viral vector-based ones like AstraZeneca. And while rare, there have been reported cases of potentially grave side effects like blood clots due to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And certain populations are at an increased risk for those types of scenarios. An employee should not have to choose between their job and their health. And again, to force compliance in the way that the firm has done is just not reasonable. And this brings us to another somewhat concerning aspect of the policy, is that it's not clear that it's going to leave room for people's medical concerns and religious reasons that they may have to not get the vaccine. And so, although employers may have a right to make certain inquiries as to the efficacy of those claims in certain prescribed circumstances, the employer has an obligation to accommodate those persons up to the point of undue hardship. And so any kind of discipline or other adverse or differential treatment of an employee who has asserted their right not to take the vaccine on the basis of a medical or religious reason needs to be accommodated. And so I'll close out by just saying that ultimately the imposition of this policy is a change to the fundamental terms of employment. And in my view, employees would be within their rights to resign and claim a constructive dismissal and damages if the firm insists on pursuing this policy, or alternatively, if an employee is terminated for cause for failing to abide by the policy, they could pursue damages for wrongful dismissal. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will pass it over to my friend, Mr. Masterson.
Thank you, George. I want to start by saying when we're talking about fundamental terms and conditions of employment, we must keep in mind that the terms of employment of employees of the company in this situation up until last March of 2020, honor and observe regular office hours. That was a fundamental term of employment. They would show up to the office, they would work, and they would get paid. It doesn't get any more fundamental than that. Then the pandemic hits. Without question, the pandemic is the single most dire and serious public health crisis in any of our lifetimes. Now, fortunately, with the availability of approved and safe vaccines, we can finally realize on a practical basis that life does not end for people who do not have the disease. Like always, for people to survive economically, people must work. And employers have responsibilities when it comes to their employees and their workers. Principal among those responsibilities is to protect and promote the health and safety of all workers. The Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario gives a statutory obligation on employers to maintain a safe work environment and to take all reasonable precautions to protect the health and safety of workers. The most reasonable way in this case to discharge this statutory obligation is to insist on vaccination for employees. Now, if you look at the background in this example, from March of 2020 until September of 2021, this employer encouraged all employees and staff to work from home. This was accomplished by deploying technology and having employees work remotely. The decision was made to protect the health and safety of all workers. Now, essential workers, a skeletal crew of accounting or building maintenance and some mailroom staff would continue to report to the office and observe relevant COVID-19 protocols. Principal amongst those would be masking when not in your immediate workstation, limited traffic in terms of walking outside your workstation from one point to another, and of course, physical distancing. Some employees as well who simply could not accomplish some task would be required to attend the office from time to time to complete certain specific tasks. But without question, the vast majority of employees work remotely. And what is obvious is that long-term, this is simply not sustainable. Issues like communication, supervision, and monitoring and mentoring of staff is just not the same. It's certainly less than ideal, and working remotely in an office environment, while it may be a temporary fix, cannot be the new normal. It has affected morale, it has affected productivity, efficiency, and all of these things it's affected in a negative way. Most importantly, the mental health and the psychological well-being of employees continues to be affected. It suffered due to the pandemic, and working from home has just complicated and added on to that. And as such, a safe return to the office will promote the mental health and safety of employees. Additionally, prolonged remote working affects in a material way the financial viability of this enterprise. The terms of the employment up until March of 2020 were that every employee had the expectation that they would have to observe agreed upon office hours. And this term is viable once again with the availability of safe and approved vaccines. The expectation is that all employees would be eligible for at least one dose by September of 21, by September of this year. We know that at least one dose has been administered with increasing regularity over the past 30 days for sure. This month alone, we're expecting a massive influx of vaccines to arrive as well. Now, what happens with those employees who refuse to get vaccinated? What must be remembered is the employer is entitled to know the reason for and determine if the objection or the refusal to get vaccinated is valid. And to be valid, it has to be based on medical religious, or other grounds that are protected by the Human Rights Code? And if so, if the employer determines that there's a valid objection, these employees will be accommodated. But in terms of accommodation, it's a two-way street. Attendance during regular working hours for those employees who choose not to be vaccinated would be off the table. If they attended the office, it would have to be after hours. It would have to be, if practical, after hours with all existing and applicable COVID-19 protocols, or they would have to continue working from home. Also, if employees think that they cannot be vaccinated and simply return to the workplace, that would lead to potentially, and most probably, those employees who are vaccinated having a right to refuse unsafe work. If they have to work in proximity to somebody who's not vaccinated, again, that would lead to a work stoppage and affect the viability of the enterprise. Now, the employer has the right to schedule employees to fewer hours, to change hours, or to assign different duties or responsibilities if this can reasonably accommodate employees who have valid human rights-based objections to getting the vaccine. But for those who are not vaccinated, we can't expect things to be the same as for employees who are vaccinated. And the duty to accommodate must be assessed in the context of employees' duty to protect, the employer's duty to protect the safety of all workers. What's clear is that the employer will make, and the employer alone will make, the initial determination as to whether an objection is valid, and if not valid, and if the employee refuses vaccination, one result may be that the employee may be deemed to have chosen not to return to work when required to do so, and in fact to have abandoned their employment. And that is a material change in the circumstances and the fundamental terms and conditions of employment as well. Subject to any response or questions, that's my position.
What I'm going to do is invite George to briefly respond to Joe, and at the same time invite everyone who's participating to submit questions through the Q&A portal at the bottom of the screen. And I have a couple of questions that I will put to these two participants after we hear from George. So George, briefly, if you can, a response to Joe.
Well, I thank you so much for that, Joe. I think in terms of fundamental terms of employment, it may have been at the time in March 2020 that it was a fundamental term of employment that employees work those hours, but that has changed. And where we are now is that the employee is able to work from home. That has changed the terms of employment. What I was getting at there is that the requirement to produce evidence, medical evidence, is a change to a fundamental term of employment. So that's, I think there was some perhaps miscommunication there. But I take all your points, Joe. I think if I can step back a little bit and sort of address the situation, I think what we see here is a lot of arguments will be really fact specific. And so something that I picked up on, at least when I saw this, the specific fact scenario, were some of the dates, the timelines, right? I think if I was pushed, if you gave me some truth serum, I would say yes. I mean, eventually, the employee is going to have to get back to work at some point, right? And I think the real question is, from an employer's perspective, is when does that happen? When is it reasonable, to force the hand of the employee back to work? Because I do take Joe's point. I think he's correct. I think that position is correct, that eventually it will need to go back. It's understood that this is a temporary arrangement. But the question is, and I think I would still push back as to whether or not that timeline is necessary. If this was a real world scenario, I would certainly think that there's reason to push back here as to why September 7th has to be a date that we're abiding by here. It just doesn't strike me as necessary or even consistent with where we are in terms of where we are in terms of the inflow of vaccines. But anyway, I'll make those comments. If Joe wants to make some further comments, happy to chat it out.
Okay, so I've got two questions that I think might be in the minds of some of our participants. First, the fact situation says requiring all members. Mandating seems to be an issue that may bring the employer into some difficulty with the human rights legislation. And I'm just wondering, first of all, if it was not a mandated, but the employer offered an incentive to employees, is there a distinction to be made to do those two situations where the employer arbitrarily mandates, or alternatively, the employer says anybody who can prove that they've been vaccinated will get a gift certificate or a cash bonus, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make any difference to the facts, Joe?
I think it does, and it's an interesting observation. It's a good one. I haven't heard of this happening locally or in Ontario, but certainly south of the border, it's happening with alarming regularity. Employers are offering financial incentives to employees to get vaccinated and to return to work under normal conditions, and that would seem to affect or in essence weed out those people who don't have valid objections, but want to state that they do, or want to try and make a case that they do somehow or some way. It becomes obviously a personal choice if you're agreeing to take the money and get the vaccine. And any objection that might otherwise have been raised is just not going to hold water. So I think it does make a difference, because it makes it brings out the fact that it's a voluntary thing that's being done by the employer. They're not being coerced, they're being incentivized, which is quite different.
The other issue that I think employers have to be aware of is any infringement on human rights. And if someone raises a religious basis for refusing the vaccine, simply says it's contrary to my religious beliefs, how far can the employer go in making those inquiries and still avoid the possibility of a human rights application? George?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously you have to tread carefully here, Michael. So I mean, one thing that I'd want to say there is, it's my understanding that if for example, a religious contention that they were forbidden from taking the vaccine or something like that. I mean, if the employee has a sincere belief that that's the case, and absent some reason that the employer has to disbelieve the employee, right? If the employer has some good reason to think that the employee is not telling the truth, I mean, I would say, obviously you'd want to get professional advice about it, but I would say you can certainly make inquiries to verify if the request is bona fide, especially if you have reasons to believe that it's not. As to how far you can go, I mean, again, you want to tread carefully about that. And it's so long as they have a sincere belief that that is a requirement of their faith, then I think I think it's going to be difficult at that point. But maybe Joe has a different perspective on
Not
that.
really. No, I think that the employer would be entitled to ask if this is an honest and conscientious type of objection. I mean, if they honestly object on religious grounds to this, that's about as far as the employer can go in terms of asking. I mean, it's really a question of saying, really, do you really believe this? And if they say yes, then that's it. Now, the employer could take the position, no, I don't believe you, and then you're into a contest of the facts. Who is going to be believed?
I think, as both George and Joe pointed out, this is really a very important issue. I just completed a 10-year term as a vice chair of the Human Rights Tribunal, and I can tell you that by over inquiring as to the religious belief, there's no doubt that the employer will find himself responding to an application. And it may be as easy as if the employee says, I can't or I won't based upon my religious beliefs. You have to accept that. So this is an area in which you would want to get some advice, legal advice as to how far you can go. And in that same regard, let me tell you that notwithstanding, we've been living with COVID since March or so of 2020. I inquired this week of the Human Rights Tribunal, and there have not been any cases that have come through. They're still in the process because of problems in getting to adjudications. So you should look very carefully to see if there's any case precedent that gives you some guidance as to what you can and cannot do. So I see there's one question in the Q&A. Megan Quinlan, do you want to read that question to us so that we can deal with that?
Absolutely. So we have a question that reads, if everyone has been working in the office for the most part throughout the pandemic, does this change the requirement in regard to employer mandating the vaccine as we have all been working together, masking, distancing, etc.? Is there a problem now that some employees are being vaccinated as it's not about people returning to work?
Joe, George?
Yeah, I'll just briefly start out. I don't think that it would make much of a difference if employees were regularly in attendance, because again, the motivation from the employer is to take all reasonable steps to protect the health and safety of workers. So what their position would be that we are not just encouraging, but we are providing a safe workplace if everybody gets the vaccine. I think, though, that one thing that's obvious from this discussion is, I mean, the million-dollar question is, can the employer force the employee to get a vaccine? The clear answer is no, they can't force, because objections, if valid, would show that every employee may not be able to be vaccinated. But I mean, absent those valid objections and efforts at accommodation, I think that the employer is within its rights to say, you know, everybody, this is a health and safety crisis, and the way that we're going to deal with this is we're going to have people vaccinated.
Thank you. I see there's two more questions in the Q&A. Let's take one more question, Megan, and then we'll move on to the second scenario and try and pick up the remaining question at the end if time permits. So question number 2.
So question number 2 is actually twofold. The first part is, if an employee says that they simply don't trust vaccines as they have not been tested for long enough, very much afraid of the potential short-term and long-term side effects, and there are medical professionals to confirm that, is that a valid objection? You know, this is about people's health and life eventually, and no employers have the right to force them to take something into their body that they are very opposed to. Is this correct?
It's a great question. I think what Joe was getting at there, if I can pick up on, if I was just to play devil's advocate, I would say it sounds like they haven't, absent something under the Human Rights Code, sort of fitting their objection into some sort of protection under the Human Rights Code, right? So depending on the way that was worded, it's kind of was bordering on, I have a medical reason or doctors telling me not to take this vaccine. Then I think we're into human rights territory, and that's where we go. But if I could put it this way, anti-vaxxer kind of objection, right? I think in this climate, I think courts and tribunals are going to be much more willing to allow the employer to take those steps where they have otherwise, perhaps in the past, not have taken those steps, right? And I think part of the issue there is that the efficacy of the vaccines is really remarkable, actually, right? Especially some of the mRNA vaccines, which are 95, 94%, right? And I think in some previous cases or arbitration cases, some of the objections, some of the reasons that an arbitrator, would say, well, you're not going to get the flu shot, you don't have to mandate the flu shot, is that it wasn't clear that it would actually, what kind of effect it would actually have, right? And I think what's different here is, well, first of all, the threat is much different. It's a much more, it's much more, I mean, I'm no doctor, but the evidence that I've seen is that the COVID-19 disease is much more harmful than the regular flu, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that the vaccines that we do have are much better, right, at preventing harmful symptoms, exposure, that sort of thing. So I think we're in kind of uncharted territory. I would say that kind of objection, I would tend to agree with Joe, unless we can kind of say that we're going to fit it into a human rights issue, then it might be difficult for that employee to say no.
Okay, so this is interesting because we started with the prospect or the proposition of requiring or mandating, and I think Joe's position is that an employer cannot mandate an employee to take the vaccine. We've heard George's perspective on the issue. I think there are clearly two sides to this argument, and before an employer takes that dramatic step, he should probably or she should probably consult with a legal specialist and get some direction as to how it can be done to avoid the possibility of creating a constructive dismissal situation, or alternatively a human rights application. So what I'm going to do now is, if we can, let's move on to the second scenario. If we can post that one, we'll give you an opportunity to read it, and then we'll have a discussion with George and Alicia on this one. Okay, so again, we're skirting around the issue of mandating. Let's start with George, if we can, from the perspective of the employer in this situation. Take off your employee hat and put on your employer hat now.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay. The first thing, my first submission that I would like to make, first thing I want to get across to my union friends is that the company hears the concerns of the union. There is nothing more important to the company than the health and well-being of its employees. And while we sympathize greatly with the union's position on this matter, the company just simply cannot acquiesce to their requests. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, the imposition of workplace rules is the prerogative of the employer. Respectfully, the union is not permitted to dictate to the employer what workplace rules the company will adopt. This is stated in the management rights clause in our collective agreement, and likely in the collective agreement of many other organizations. Therefore, there is no basis for this grievance within the collective agreement, and it should be dismissed on that basis. Nonetheless, it's prudent for us to address the company's rationale in its decision. We have to point out that there is no statutory basis for the imposition of this workplace rule. It is one thing to encourage our employees to obtain the vaccine, which of course the company is willing to do and has done, but it is another thing entirely to insist that our employees obtain the vaccine on pain of termination, which is what would have to happen in order to implement the union's proposal. Now, the provincial and federal governments could have easily enacted legislation to allow employers to impose a requirement for vaccination. However, they have not done so, which we find to be significant. It would appear the provincial and federal governments do not believe it's within their authority to do so, or even prudent to do so, even in the face of this unprecedented global pandemic. Again, the company is not being obtuse, rather the company is thinking of the union's membership. To impose the union's rule would represent an unprecedented and unauthorized intrusion into their private affairs. The company would need to forcefully collect sensitive medical information, which again, it has no statutory basis to do. The other thing we want to point out is that the rule is not necessary. Why use the stick when the carrot will work? We have proposed reasonable alternatives for the union, which we find to be acceptable. For example, we propose voluntary incentives for employees to obtain the vaccines, such as a monetary sum. The way it would work is that employees may voluntarily obtain the vaccine, and upon providing proof of vaccination, which is up to the employee would be entitled to some gift or sum of money. Because this process is voluntary, it should be preferred and explored prior to implementing the union's rule. What shouldn't be lost here is the fact that the company has coped relatively well during these uncertain times, not perfectly, no workplace is, and it has done so without the immunity afforded by the vaccines through the use of PPE, screening before entering into the workplace, and social distancing where possible. The company has done relatively well. With that, I will end my submissions and pass it over to my friend, Ms. Christian.
Alicia?
Thank you. So the employer has a statutory obligation to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. The science is clear that vaccines provide the recipient with immunity against COVID. In the past, unions have filed grievances against employer vaccine or mask policies in the context of mandatory influenza vaccinations. There have been 2 labor arbitration decisions that found mandatory vaccination policies were unreasonable. However, those cases can be distinguished given the nature of COVID-19. As we all know, COVID is a highly infectious disease with very significant symptoms, including in some cases death. This is a very different situation than the health risk posed by influenza. At those arbitrations, the arbitrators found that there was little evidence of asymptomatic transmission with influenza. The same cannot be said of COVID. The influenza vaccine in some years has very limited effectiveness. The COVID vaccines range in efficacy from 76 to 95%. This is a much higher efficacy rate than the influenza vaccine. Arbitrators were critical that there was no scientific evidence in favor of the use of masks preventing the transmission of influenza. To date, whether the vaccines prevent transmission of the COVID virus remains under study. However, following the SARS outbreak in 2003, a commission of inquiry was conducted and led by Justice Archie Campbell. Justice Campbell recommended that the precautionary principle is to be put into practice in order to prevent unnecessary death or illness. The precautionary principle can be defined as when an activity raises threats of harm to human health, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Essentially, it can be boiled down to better safe than sorry. This principle has been incorporated into the Health Protection and Promotion Act and has been cited by the Provincial Chief Medical Officer of Health in directives that have been issued during the pandemic. One thing that's missing from our fact scenario is the type of workplace that we are dealing with. A union would have a stronger grievance if it represents workers from a workplace in which it's impossible for the employer to effectively implement social distancing protocols and require workers to be in close proximity of others. For example, an office place versus, on a factory line where everybody has a station that they have to be assigned to. If there were ventilation concerns at the workplace, that would provide a stronger case for the policy. Or if the workers were responsible for being around a vulnerable population or a population group that's unable to get vaccinated, there'd be a stronger ground for this grievance. Again, a union representing workers in a workplace where they can work from home effectively or could attend the workplace and social distance may have a harder fight on their hands with this grievance. One thing to be considered when deciding whether a mandatory vaccination policy is reasonable will be the infection rate data. Obviously, infection rate data for the industry. Obviously, the higher the infection rate, the stronger the case can be made for a mandatory vaccination policy. If there was a grievance of this nature, both sides would likely be looking at having to retain experts to present medical and scientific evidence to the arbitrator. In addition to protecting the safety of union members, a mandatory vaccination policy would also protect their ability to earn a living. There is the concern of forced unpaid absences from work due to workplaces being shut down by a chief medical officer of health. Both Peel and Toronto chief medical officers have issued shutdown orders to workplaces with 5 or more active coronavirus cases in a span of 14 days. And those shutdowns are for a 10-day period. I imagine they could be extended by the chief medical officer if there was still concern about spread of COVID in the workplace. The medical officer of Peel said employers should continue paying employees during a shutdown, but has no actual authority to force an employer to do so. Just to make sure nobody in the audience from London and area gets nervous, the London Middlesex Health Unit Chief Medical Officer has not issued any such orders, nor at this time is there an indication that the local health unit would be enacting such a policy. So with that, I turn it over to you, Michael.
George, you first of all, let me again invite questions from those attendees that we have. George, do you have any response to what Alicia has told us?
Yeah, I mean, if I could take off my company hat. Yeah, I mean, I think in this specific fact scenario, it'd be difficult, I think, for the union to compel, right, the employer to do this, just because, as I mentioned off the top, I think there is a sort of general boilerplate management rights clause in most collective agreements, which would say that this type of thing is the prerogative of the employer. Now, in our discussions while we were preparing for this, it was brought up that perhaps a collective agreement was signed pre-COVID, right? And these are new circumstances, and therefore the union may have a way to get around that rule or clause, and that may be the case. I'm a little skeptical of that, but I like Alicia's point about, in my view, I think if we tweak the facts a little bit, it could go one way as opposed to the other, and I think. Certainly, I take Alicia's point that if you're in close proximity with people in the workplace, and you have to be, there's no real viable option for social distancing if you're working with vulnerable populations. Obviously, I think those things are relevant. So I think what these fact scenarios can do is sort of highlight, that it is very fact specific, and that if you tweak the facts a little bit here and there, I think it may change sort of how things get decided.
Just to add to that, both parties will need to, before they think about enacting, or the employer obviously enacting the mandatory vaccination policy, the collective agreement has to be reviewed. In at least one of the arbitration decisions dealing with influenza vaccinations, there was actually a vaccination clause in that collective agreement. Now it involved a nursing union. So if your workplace is a healthcare setting, your collective agreement might actually have already a clause dealing with vaccinations, whether it can be compelled by the employer or not. And certainly, if it's not currently in your collective agreement, it will likely be something you'll be negotiating about the next time you are renewing the collective agreement.
Thank you, Alicia and George. I like to think of myself as being a practical person, and as a lawyer, as a litigator, my job is as much to keep my clients out of court as to represent them in court. So I think this fact situation suggests, and having heard from both George and Alicia, that before you even get to the grievance stage, there should be wholesome and fulsome discussion between the union and the employer as to how there can be some accommodation that is acceptable to both sides. In today's world, I think people are almost too anxious to throw down the gauntlet and get themselves embroiled in a heated dispute. And sometimes in situations like this, some quiet discussions between the union and the employer may lead to a resolution that satisfies everyone and avoids the possibility of finding yourself before a court or a tribunal. Megan, I see we have at least one question. Can we have that question?
Yes, we do. It's from Jan Daniluk, related to this fact scenario. She is asking, does time away to get the vaccine count as incentive?
I'm sorry, could we have that again?
Sure. Does time away to get the vaccine count as incentive?
Well, let me try and answer that, and George and Joel and Alicia can correct me. I believe that the provincial government recently imposed regulations that require an employer to grant an employee, I think it's up to 3 hours in order to get the vaccination. Similar to the provisions around Election Day, that employees are to be given time off to be able to get out and vote. So my personal view, subject to what my colleagues have to say, is that would not be considered to be an incentive because it has been regulated by the government. But do any of you agree or disagree with me? George?
I think that's right, Michael. I mean, I'm not sure on the exact time. I'll leave it to you to tell us if it's the 3 hours or however long it is. I am aware of such a rule, and I think just in general, I think providing somebody with the statutory minimums, right, would not be. It's something they're owed anyway, right? And so as far as encouraging people to get the vaccine, I'm not sure how efficacious that would be, I suppose, I'll put it that way, right? So what I had in mind when I made those comments and what we were speaking about in the previous fact scenario was, a nominal sum, right? And I think Michael had mentioned Tim Hortons gift card or something like that, right? Something to incentivize the employee to comply, right? To get their consent. So I'd agree with your comments there, Michael.
Now, following up on that, if the employer says to the employee, I understand that there are sometimes delays in getting through the process, and you have to stand in line, et cetera, take the day off and get your vaccine, and just let me know that, give me some evidence that you've taken it the next day. That may be an incentive to encourage people, because as George has pointed out, it's beyond the minimum that's been regulated, and by extending that extra time, it might be considered an incentive. Joe, do you have something you want to add? You're muted, Joe.
Thank you. I agree with what's been said. I mean, if it's a regulation that's mandated, then then no, it probably wouldn't be characterized as an incentive. And I mean, and even if it was an incentive, I really don't see an issue with that.
Okay, let's, any other questions in the hamper there, Megan?
Yeah, we had one from the first fact scenario from Nicole, but I believe it might be applicable here as well, which reads, upon review of the Essential Services Contingency Reserve, should we apply, would that allow all our employees the opportunity to receive the vaccination?
Who would like to tackle that one? Nobody seems to. So let's do this. Nicole, it doesn't seem that anybody's in a position to answer that question. If at the end of the program you want to email one of the panelists, I am sure they will undertake to get you a quick response to the question that you've asked. And we don't want you to walk away from here with an unanswered question. So let me suggest that you do that. And at the end of the program, there will be email addresses, and feel free to approach any one of my colleagues.
Michael, before we move on to the next fact scenario, I did just want to add, obviously the provincial government hasn't mandated workplace vaccinations, and it said that they don't intend to, but it did announce on April the 13th that it's permitting qualifying employers to host on-site vaccination clinics. There's some criteria that need to be met, obviously, to be a qualifying employer. And those include that the workplace has to be within an identified hotspot community and have had a previous COVID-19 outbreak or is at risk for outbreak. The on-site clinic will vaccinate employees that cannot work at home. The employer, this is the interesting part, the employer will also vaccinate those in the local community, either at the on-site clinic or an alternative location in consultation with the local public health unit. And then the employer is going to be responsible for setting up, operating, and funding the on-site vaccination clinic, as well as the community clinic being sponsored, if not on-site. So I checked the Middlesex London Health Unit. We're not a hotspot community, so employers within our region don't fall within the criteria for a qualifying employer, at least at this time. As we have a more stable supply of vaccines, it could be that they'll change the criteria and allow people outside of hotspot communities or employers outside of hotspot communities to do these on-site vaccination clinics for their employees.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm sure most people have noticed that south of the border, they take a somewhat different approach to this whole issue. And I have taken particular note that many of the state universities, not the private universities, but the state universities have mandated that before students can enroll and start their fall studies in September, they're going to have to prove that they have been vaccinated. That certainly isn't the lay of the land in Ontario, but given the desire to vaccinate as many people as possible, it may well be that a university or a large manufacturer or a significant employer may want to even apply to the health unit to be so designated and not only look after their own people, staff, etc., but also the local community as a community gesture. So that's something for the larger employers to at least give some thought to. Okay, let's move on to the third fact scenario. If we can put this one up. And it'll give you an opportunity to read it. And let me just say, in the first line, it says restaurant and bar. I think this applies as well to small businesses of any nature or kind, a retailer, a salon, an office setting. So I think this one has very wide and broad implications. So let's read this one first and see where we go. Okay, let's start with Alicia. And Alicia, let's put you in the position of being the owner of a small bar or a small business on Richmond Row or anywhere in the city, and you want to impose this requirement. Let's have a discussion on this one.
Thanks, Michael. An organization conducting commercial activities such as operating a restaurant may only collect, use, or disclose personal information for purposes a reasonable person would consider appropriate in the circumstances. As the owner of a commercial establishment, there are statutory obligations to protect the safety of employees, as well as those people that would be attending at the restaurant and bar. The purpose of requiring employees and patrons to show proof of vaccination is to prevent the spread of COVID-19 while people are attending the restaurant. The proprietor will want to limit the amount of personal information to only that which is necessary to meet the purchase for which it was collected. The easiest way to do this would be to have a vaccination bouncer at the front door. Just like you show your driver's license to enter a licensed establishment after a certain hour, you'd have to show your vaccine passport. Once the bouncer verified that you had your vaccination, then you can enter. And that's it. You put your passport away and you go in and enjoy your time at the restaurant. So the restaurant would not record any information related to the vaccination. If the proprietor were to require a vaccine passport, say, for example, after our current lockdown, so hopefully by June the 1st, this current lockdown will be done, there is personal information that they already have to record and keep for contact tracing purposes as required by provincial health orders. And we're all very familiar with, going to a restaurant and being asked the standard COVID screening questions. Do you have certain symptoms? Have you traveled? Have you been in contact with somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID? Sometimes our temperatures are being taken and name and telephone number or emails being recorded. So arguably the health orders that are currently in place require the proprietor to collect more personal information than a policy asking you to show a certificate that you've received a vaccination would. The proprietor will need to develop a vaccine or a vaccination verification policy that includes the purpose for the collection of the information, how that information is going to be collected, who will have access to that information, and if they choose to record information, which I would suggest they don't, but if they chose to, how it's going to be stored, the safeguards to protect the information, and for how long it will be retained and how it will be destroyed. As well, the policy will need to be reviewed regularly to determine if it's still needed. Is it still reasonable in those circumstances? You need to be taking into account what are the infection rate in your local community, what is the vaccination rate in the community. So the federal government has indicated that it's in discussion with international partners about a vaccine passport program to travel outside of Canada and to come to Canada. So the government, or the federal government, is doing this for the purpose of presenting Canada as a safe travel destination. So it's not unreasonable that a business owner would want to have a vaccine passport policy to show to its customers that it's a safe place to visit. So those are my comments.
Joe.
Thank you. A number of very interesting issues raised in the fact scenario and touched upon by Alicia. We should remember here that compulsory vaccination policies are really nothing new. Take, for example, children who have to be vaccinated before attending public schools. This has been going on for quite some time, and they have exemptions, obviously, for some people who are, again, have valid objections. They may be immunocompromised, they may be religious objections, any grounds, again, protected under the human rights legislation. But this is a little bit different here. And it's different because kids have to go to school. They don't have much say in the matter, and parents have to send their kids to school for the most part. And the whole idea of these compulsory vaccination policies is to promote and protect health and safety. So there's a medical purpose to this. In this fact scenario, it's a bit of a gray area. Is it a medical purpose that would encourage disclosure of personal medical information, or is it purely a business purpose? Is the idea here for somebody to make money? So when we're talking about the use of these certifications or vaccine passports for non-medical purposes, this is where it raises a number of socio-ethical, privacy type legal questions that really merit careful consideration. Alicia touched on the security of the data. Who is it that issues these passports? Because if these passports are to work, they have to be trustworthy. So, for example, a clever fraudster could sell fake certificates online. It could be an app on your phone. And again, who is qualified? Is a bouncer qualified to check paperwork or proof of certification of vaccination? Is that person at the door going to be up to the job? If we look at different places around the world where this, has really been in place for some time, look at China, for example. They've been using compulsory health apps on phones since almost the beginning of the pandemic. And not surprisingly, anyone's location on their smartphone could produce, data and be used for purposes that it wasn't intended. A lot of these apps produce QR codes. They determine if someone, is free to use an indoor space or to travel from A to B without restrictions. Not surprisingly, once this data is collected, in China at least, it's shared with the police. So it shows, who's going to limit the transmission and sharing of this data? You can see where this might be headed. We know that thankfully we're not a police state, but we have to be concerned when information is gathered and disclosed as to where it ends up. All right. So privacy is a big deal. And because the entire premise here of a vaccine passport is sharing sensitive information about a person's health. And you have to consider, what will this health information, when in the hands of a private or a third party, mean with respect to privacy and data storage? Who can and who will use this information? And who will it be shared with? And what recourse does a patron or a person have if there's negligent or improper use of this information, whether sharing or storage of it? So these are a number of considerations that have to be borne in mind. Also, when it comes to vaccine passports, the question of fairness arises. We know that most vaccine programs and rollouts proceed according, at least in Ontario, have proceeded according to seniority. Nursing home residents, senior citizens were eligible first, and it kind of rolled down 60s, 70s, 60s, 50s, downward, and eventually included essential and healthcare workers. But for the vast majority, it's been a question of seniority. So clearly, there's discrimination based on age, and it might be valid discrimination. It might be able to be upheld, but we know that discrimination based on age, if involved with a government worker undertaking, could raise concerns under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for discrimination based on age. Also, human rights codes also protect age as a ground to guard against discrimination. Now, there's no question in a scenario like this that the younger the person is, and young people like to frequent bars and restaurants as much as anyone else, they're going to be discriminated against based on age and potentially their health status if they're unable to receive the vaccine because of government or regulatory policy. And this would apply to employees in this this situation as well. All right, so another issue, if we're looking at human rights angles and questions of fairness, what we're hearing more and more is that COVID-19 issues have brought to the fore issues of discrimination against minority or racialized populations. And we know that if people have to produce identification of any sort, then the potential for racial profiling exists. And so does the potential for harassment when determining the authenticity of passport or certification. We know now, that some groups and some communities have suffered historical biases. And these are precisely the groups that may face increased scrutiny if additional certification or identification or passports are required. So what is necessary here is that uniform rules need to be established to ensure that these groups are not unfairly scrutinized, and to ensure that all groups who should be protected, whether under the Human Rights Code or otherwise, are in fact protected. Now, conceptually, these passports raise a number of interesting issues, but one has to ask oneself, do they really do the job that they're intended to do? I mean, they may seem like a good idea, but do they do the job that they're supposed to do? We know that the WHO in February, this past February, argued that vaccinated people should not be exempt from existing lockdown or quarantine rules or COVID-19 protocols in terms of physical distancing and masking. And the reason is because it's generally accepted that while the vaccines are effective in reducing severe illness and probably preventing death, it's generally accepted that even vaccinated individuals can contract COVID-19 or one of its more recently spreading variants. And once contracted, a person with a vaccine could spread it nonetheless. Now, the symptomatology might not be as severe, but the possibility certainly exists for contraction and spread. So, in other words, whatever conclusions are arrived at today with respect to the efficacy of a vaccine could change tomorrow. A novel variant for which vaccines are ineffective could arise at any time, and that would render these passports useless. Right. In a lot of ways, we have to, when looking at this issue, take guidance from our government. And from that perspective, this whole idea may be premature. If we have a number of individual businesses, works, enterprises, undertakings that are enacting their own rules, then this is a private ad hoc mandate for proof of vaccination. When we know that the federal and provincial governments haven't even finalized their intentions on this issue. So we could be left with a situation where, for example, if you went down Richmond Row, you'd have different rules for different places. And there's no real reason that that should be other than a person's private interests. So again, going back to this idea of efficacy of vaccines, again, we know that various vaccines may have various success rates or efficacy against the disease. We know that different mutations or variants are here. So this isn't a question that's as simple as vaccinating a general population, let's say, of children against measles or yellow fever. We have to be concerned with the duration of the protection of the vaccine, because this is still a new disease and things are changing rapidly. All you have to do is watch the news, and we see that things can change from day to day, from week to week, month to month. So we don't know, for example, how long, for sure, these vaccines are going to be effective for. one of the consequences would be currently that don't bring your kids to this restaurant because nobody under 16 is getting vaccinated yet. So what this all leads to is a realization that there really is a lack of data. There's not enough data on some vaccines. There's not any data on the efficacy of these passports. It's an evolving scientific study. Finally, the usefulness of these passports and a vaccine passport system, it's odd, but it's inversely related to how quickly an area, a population, a city, a province, a country can vaccinate its citizens. So early on in the process, when not as many people are vaccinated, very few are going to benefit from a vaccine passport system. And then you get towards the end, passports are going to be of little help or even totally unnecessary when most people have the vaccination. So thank you. Those are my points.
Let me pose this on a more realistic situation. I have a store on Richmond Street, or I'm the proprietor of a licensed establishment. It's a private business. I have a rule. It's right on the front door of my establishment. It says no shoes, no shirt, no service. Or now you'll see signs that say mask required. What prevents? Is there anything that prevents a restaurateur or a business owner for insisting upon proof of vaccination in order to gain entry? Obviously, the last thing a bar or a restaurant wants is a breakout, and then after having struggled for the past 15 months or so to be stigmatized, publicized that they suffered a breakout. So they want to take the precaution of trying to at least minimize infection. So they just say, quite simply, if you can't satisfy me that you've been vaccinated, I'm sorry, you can't come in. Can somebody do that? Is that within their rights as a private business person?
I would, in my opinion, I would think that it is. They're obviously going to run the risk of alienating some patrons, and some people may see the sign and turn around and say, I'm not comfortable sharing that information, and I'm going to go down the street and shop at this other store where I'm not required to give that. I mean, that kind of a policy does run the risk of a possible complaint to the privacy commissioner. Again, I mean, you'd have, make sure that you have your vaccination policy stating why you're asking for that information. There have not been any privacy commissioner decisions on that issue as of yet. So it's really going to come down to a decision of the business owner. The one thing that I was curious to see what will happen is what kind of requirements an insurance company might have of their insureds in terms of trying to protect against outbreaks and possible claims being brought against them if somebody does get COVID while at their establishment. The Ontario government has passed legislation to protect businesses who are making an honest effort to comply with COVID public health guidelines. Arguably, the proprietor of this business could say, well, I'm trying to provide a safe place for my patrons and my employees. And this was one thing that I did in an effort to make an honest effort to comply and provide a safe place. To me, I think it's up to the business owner themselves. And again, running the risk of whether or not you're going to lose customers because of it, which is a possibility, and possibly be dealing with a privacy complaint. I mean, that could be brought by somebody that's offended by your policy, perhaps. But as long as you are able to explain to the privacy commissioner the purpose for collecting that information, and it would be considered reasonable in the circumstances. And then that goes to Joe's point about how long how long do we need a vaccine passport? Obviously once herd immunity is achieved in the community, it really, do we still need it?
Well, this is interesting, and I guess the converse to your suggestion that people will not patronize that business. There may be the other half of the population who say, "Look, I'm going to that restaurant because they've taken these steps to protect me and their staff, and I feel more comfortable going there than down the street where they don't have the rules." So it's certainly something that the business with has to carefully assess. I see that there's a couple of questions in the chat. Let's deal with those questions. And if there are any more general questions that relate to the topic that don't relate specifically to the scenarios that we have introduced, please feel free to submit them, and we'll try to get to them as time permits. So Megan, can we deal with the two in the chat? A question, they're in the chat, I see. Are there any questions in the question and answer?
No, there actually aren't any in the Q&A currently. So if anyone has any questions that they would like answered, please do submit them.
Well, we'll just take a moment here to reflect upon it. By the way, the person who asked me specifically what it was like during the pandemic in 1918, could you please identify yourself?
Actually, I can add something further to the current discussion. I think, once again, human rights issues are going to potentially apply in a situation where a private business owner who generally can establish the rules for patrons' conduct and behavior when they enter the premises. For example, a business who has a no shoes, no shirt, no service type of policy. That has to be distinguished. I mean, entirely valid, but that has to be distinguished with the no vaccination policy, because people may have valid medical reasons for not having a vaccination. And if those are borne out, then it's clearly discrimination based on a protected ground in the Human Rights Code. So this, I mean, again, very fact specific as all these cases are. Just on the issue of vaccine passports, what I've recently read is that, and probably many of you have heard, Israel has been probably the first country to, if they haven't achieved herd immunity, they're pretty darn close. Their vaccination rollout was comprehensive and complete, and they employed vaccine passports at restaurants, bars up and down the beaches. And generally speaking, people had no problem flashing their green pass. I mean, all these issues still would bear consideration from our perspective, but as you might expect, there would be a lot of people here who, if they were vaccinated and had proof, would be more than happy to show it.
I would agree with what Joe has said. Just even in terms of the security concerns on the phone and things like that, there's already, like, it boggles my mind as somebody that works in the area of privacy, how unconcerned some people are about the amount of data that they have on their phone. Every app that wants access to their contacts, to their pictures, to their location, they don't even stop for a second to think about whether or not it's actually needed. And they just say yes, 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 so that they can play the game or have access to whatever service the app is providing. And there are ways to protect data on your phone. The federal government did a really good job with the COVID alert app in terms of privacy protection, running it through Bluetooth in terms of Wi-Fi to cut down on the information that can be obtained from that app. So, I mean, there are certainly security precautions that can be put into place. Obviously, none of it's foolproof. And, if a hacker if there's a will, some hackers will find a way to get at that data. So certainly, security concerns are something that needs to be kept in mind, but people seem to have a lot of people have, I think, a bit of a laissez-faire approach to protecting their personal information.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the Q&A. We have some time left, but there's no sense keeping people from their responsibilities today. I want to thank everyone for attending. I hope this has been helpful, informative in the day-to-day operation of your own enterprise. On the screen now are the contacts for the four of us. Feel free to contact us at our email addresses with any specific question you might have. I speak not only for myself, but my colleagues that we would be more than welcome to answer any questions that you have. We may not give you legal advice, but we can at least guide you in the right direction and give you some help during these difficult times. So let me once again thank everyone for participating this morning. I hope that you all are well and continue to be well, and you stay safe. And let's hope that we see the pandemic and the restrictions that are presently in place in the rearview mirror, and in the not too distant future, we'll be able to give our kids and grandkids and friends and neighbors a hug and share a drink or a meal with them, and have this all behind us. So thank you very much for your attendance, and have a good rest of the day and a great weekend. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.